The day I finally realized I was being erased from my own life, I didn't cry. I didn't scream, and I didn't confront anyone. I simply stood by the bay window of my living room, a cup of lukewarm Earl Grey tea in my trembling hands, and watched two burly men muscle my late husband's mahogany piano out the front door. "Careful with the door frame, guys," Chloe's voice trilled from the foyer. It was that specific pitch she used when she wanted to sound helpful, but was actually issuing orders. "We don't want to scuff the paint. It's all about creating open, breathable spaces, right, Mom?" She turned to me, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her perfectly threaded eyebrows. She was wearing her usual uniform of beige cashmere and crisp white linen, a walking advertisement for a minimalist lifestyle blog. I looked at the empty space against the living room wall. For 38 years, Arthur's piano had sat right there. I could still see the faint, ghost-like indentations in the Persian rug where the heavy brass casters had rested. I could still remember the deep, resonant chords of the jazz pieces he would play on Sunday mornings, the way the sunlight would catch the dust motes dancing around his broad shoulders. And I could remember a little boy named David, hiding underneath that very piano, running his metal toy cars up and down its polished legs, leaving tiny scratches that Arthur refused to buff out because they were marks of a life well lived. "It really opens up the room, Eleanor," Chloe said, stepping up beside me and placing a manicured hand on my shoulder. The weight of her hand felt cold. "Plus, with your arthritis acting up last winter, having all this bulky furniture around is just a tripping hazard. We're just thinking of your safety." Your safety. That was the magic phrase. It was the Trojan horse that had breached the walls of my sanctuary. 6 months prior, my son David and his wife Chloe had moved back into my home in the quiet suburbs of Philadelphia. The premise had been entirely reasonable, even touching. The real estate market was brutal. Interest rates were skyrocketing, and they needed a place to stay just for a few months while they hunted for their forever home. David had held my hands, his eyes shadowed with the exhaustion of a 35-year-old middle manager drowning in corporate pressure, and said, "Mom, it makes sense. We can save money, and honestly, we don't like the idea of you rattling around in this big house all by yourself since Dad passed. We can help take care of you." I had agreed. What mother wouldn't? I loved my son. I missed the noise of family in the house. I had spent the last 3 years since Arthur's sudden heart attack learning how to cook for one, how to sleep on only one side of the bed, how to endure the deafening silence of a house that had once held so much life. Having them here felt like a second chance at family, but the care they brought with them didn't feel like love. It felt like a slow, meticulous dismantling of everything that made me, me. It started in the kitchen. One Tuesday morning, I came down to make my usual breakfast: 2 eggs, a slice of sourdough toast, and a pot of strong, dark roast coffee. Instead, I found Chloe emptying the contents of my pantry into heavy-duty trash bags. "Morning, Mom," she chirped, tossing a half-full bag of my favorite all-purpose flour into the garbage. "I'm doing a little detox for the house. Have you read the latest studies on processed grains and cognitive decline in seniors? It's terrifying. David and I have decided we're transitioning the household to a strictly anti-inflammatory, plant-based diet. It's exactly what your body needs at this stage." Before I could protest, my coffee maker was unplugged and relegated to the basement, replaced by a complex brushed steel juicer that sounded like an airplane taking off and produced a dark green sludge that tasted of dirt and obligation. When I tried to gently tell David that I missed my morning coffee, he just sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mom, please. Chloe spent hours researching this for your health. Her own grandmother had dementia, and Chloe is terrified of that happening to you. Can you just try to cooperate? I have a massive quarterly review coming up, and I can't manage domestic disputes right now." Cooperate. The word stung. I wasn't a hostage. I was the homeowner. But looking at my son's drawn face, the dark circles under his eyes, the tense set of his jaw, I swallowed my pride. I drank the green sludge. I let the coffee maker stay in the basement. I didn't realize that surrendering the kitchen was just the first domino to fall. Over the next few months, the landscape of my life was aggressively curated. The heavy velvet drapes Arthur and I had picked out in Boston were taken down and replaced with sheer, clinical white blinds because Chloe insisted I needed more vitamin D. My collection of vintage porcelain teacups, the ones I had scoured estate sales for over 2 decades, were boxed up and put in the attic because they were clutter that traps negative energy. Every time I tried to draw a boundary, Chloe deployed her weapon of choice. Toxic positivity disguised as medical concern. If I complained about the house being too cold because she kept the thermostat at 65 degrees, she would look at me with wide, pitying eyes. Eleanor, poor circulation is a sign of aging heart valves. I'll book you an appointment with my holistic cardiologist. If I asked where she had moved the photo album of Arthur's military days, she would put a hand on her chest and sigh. Mom, living in the past increases cortisol levels and depression. We need to keep you present. Look forward, not backward. She was suffocating me with a pillow made of wellness jargon and faux concern. But the most terrifying part wasn't what Chloe was doing. It was what she was convincing David of. The psychological warfare was so subtle, so insidious, that for a long time, I thought I truly was losing my mind. It began with my reading glasses. I always kept them on the end table by my armchair. One evening I sat down to read the paper and they were gone. I searched the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom. Nothing. Looking for these, Mom? Chloe's voice floated from the doorway. She was holding my glasses, dangling them from her manicured fingers. I found them in the refrigerator, right next to the almond milk. I stared at her, my heart giving a strange, cold flutter. The refrigerator? I haven't even opened the refrigerator since lunchtime. Chloe gave a sad, knowing look toward David, who was working on his laptop at the dining table. It's okay, Eleanor. Memory lapses are completely normal at 68. We just need to be more mindful. I didn't put them there, I insisted, my voice rising a fraction. David, I didn't put them there. David didn't even look up from his screen. Mom, nobody else would put glasses in the fridge. It's fine. Just try to be careful. If you leave things in strange places, you might leave the stove on next. A week later, I missed a dentist appointment. I had written it on the kitchen calendar, my system for 20 years. But when the receptionist called to ask where I was, I looked at the calendar, and the square for that Tuesday was blank. The ink had been perfectly erased. I told you about it yesterday, Mom, Chloe said that evening, serving me a bowl of unseasoned quinoa. I reminded you twice. Don't you remember our conversation by the sink? No, I said, panic rising in my throat like bile. No, we never had that conversation, Chloe. Mom, David slammed his laptop shut, the sharp sound echoing in the dining room. He looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't love. It was burden. It was the look a man gives a broken appliance he doesn't have the money to fix. She told you. I heard her. You're forgetting things. You're forgetting a lot of things lately, and it's starting to really worry us. He hadn't heard her. He was at the office all day yesterday. He was lying, or worse, he was so completely under Chloe's spell that he believed a memory of something that had never happened. I sat in silence, staring at the grainy quinoa, realizing with a sickening dread that the narrative of my decline was being written for me, and my own son was co-authoring it. I became hypervigilant. I started keeping a small, leather-bound notebook in the pocket of my cardigan. I wrote down everything. 8 a.m., placed keys on the entryway hook. 1:15 p.m., turned off the stove after boiling eggs. I was a prisoner in my own home, constantly gathering evidence of my own sanity. But paranoia is exhausting, and exhaustion breeds carelessness. It was mid-November. The air outside was turning bitter and gray, stripping the oak trees bare. The house felt unusually quiet. David was at a conference in Chicago, and Chloe had told me she was spending the afternoon at a spa with her friends. I decided to take advantage of the solitude. I wanted to go down to the basement to find Arthur's old woolen sweater, the dark green one that smelled faintly of cedar and his aftershave. I just wanted something that felt real, something that belonged to me. The wooden staircase leading down to the basement was steep. Arthur, ever the practical man, had installed heavy-duty black anti-slip friction tape on the edge of every single wooden step when David was just a toddler, and he had replaced it diligently every 5 years. "Can't have my girls taking a tumble," he used to say. I put my hand on the sturdy wooden rail. I took a breath, enjoying the absolute silence of the house. I stepped down onto the first step. Solid. The second step. Solid. I brought my right foot down onto the edge of the third step. Instead of the rough, familiar grip of the friction tape, my wool sock met bare, polished, slippery oak. There was no time to grab the rail. Physics took over instantly. My foot shot forward into empty air. My stomach dropped into my shoes as the world tilted violently. I remember the sharp, rushing sound of my own gasp, the terrifying weightlessness, and then the brutal, unforgiving impact. I hit the edge of the fourth step with my lower back, the sharp wood biting into my spine. My shoulder slammed against the wall, sending a shockwave of white-hot pain down my arm. I tumbled further, a chaotic jumble of limbs and terror, until I finally crashed onto the concrete floor at the bottom of the landing. For a long time, I couldn't breathe. The wind had been knocked out of my lungs completely. I lay there on the cold concrete, staring up at the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, waiting for my body to tell me what was broken. The pain in my lower back was a deep, throbbing agony, and my left wrist was throbbing with a sharp, sickening pulse. Tears, hot, angry, terrified tears, finally leaked from the corners of my eyes. I am 68 years old, I thought. A fall like this could be the end. This is how it happens. This is how old women lose their independence. It took me 20 minutes to drag myself up the stairs. Every movement was a negotiation with agony. I crawled into the kitchen, reached the phone on the counter, and called 911. The next few hours were a blur of fluorescent hospital lights, the smell of antiseptic, and the cold touch of X-ray machines. By some absolute miracle, nothing was broken. "You have dense bones, Eleanor," the young ER doctor told me, reviewing the scans. "Severe deep tissue bruising on your lumbar spine and a sprained wrist. You're very lucky. But at your age, stairs are a major risk factor. You need to be more careful." At your age. There it was again. They discharged me with a prescription for painkillers, a heavy wrist brace, and instructions to rest. Chloe arrived at the hospital just as I was being wheeled out to the lobby. She looked frantic, her hair slightly messy, her eyes wide with what looked like genuine panic. "Oh my God, Mom!" I rushed back as soon as the hospital called. She hovered over the wheelchair, wringing her hands. "I knew it. I told David this house was too dangerous for you. You could have been killed." She drove me home in her immaculate SUV. She helped me into the house, guided me to the recliner in the living room, and tucked a fleece blanket around my legs. She brought me water and my medication. To anyone looking through the window, she was the picture of a devoted, loving daughter-in-law. "You just rest, Eleanor," she whispered, stroking my hair in a way that made my skin crawl. "I've already called David. He's cutting his trip short and flying back tonight. We're going to have a serious talk about your living arrangements. We can't let this happen again." I closed my eyes and let the painkillers drag me into a heavy, dreamless sleep. When I woke up, the house was dark. The digital clock on the mantel read 2:15 a.m. My back ached with a dull, relentless throb. The house was completely silent. I knew David was probably upstairs, having arrived late. I sat up slowly, wincing as my bruised spine protested. My mind was unusually clear. The fog of the painkillers had receded, leaving behind a sharp, cold clarity. Something about the fall bothered me. I had walked up and down those basement stairs thousands of times. I knew the exact dimensions of every step by muscle memory, and I knew with absolute certainty that my foot had slipped on bare wood. I pushed off the recliner, ignoring the pain. I didn't turn on the lights. The moonlight filtering through the bare windows was enough. I walked quietly to the basement door, opened it, and flipped the switch for the stairwell light. I looked down at the third step. The black anti-slip tape was gone. Not worn down, not peeling at the edges. It was completely gone. The wood underneath was lighter than the rest of the step, a perfect rectangle of unstained oak where the adhesive had protected it from the air for a decade. I squinted, leaning closer. There were faint, sticky residue marks at the corners, fresh enough to catch the dust in the air. Someone had intentionally peeled it off. A cold shiver ran down my spine, chilling me far deeper than the winter draft. Arthur's tape didn't just fall off. It required a heat gun or a specialized solvent and a lot of elbow grease to remove. I turned off the light and closed the door. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I walked into the kitchen. Chloe was meticulous about her recycling. She separated everything. Paper in the blue bin, plastics in the green. I opened the cabinet under the sink and pulled out the green plastic bin. I dug through the empty bottles of organic kombucha and the washed-out containers of kale salad. Near the bottom, tucked neatly inside an empty oat milk carton, I found it. A tight, sticky ball of black friction tape. I pulled it out. The adhesive side was still tacky, coated in tiny splinters of old oak finish. I stood in the dark kitchen, holding the physical proof of my daughter-in-law's malice. She hadn't just waited for me to fail. She had engineered my downfall. She had set a trap on a steep staircase for a 68-year-old woman. She was willing to break my bones, or worse, just to prove a point to my son. To prove that I was a liability. To force me out of my own home. And David? Did he know? The thought made my knees weak. I slumped into a kitchen chair, gripping the ball of tape in my good hand until my knuckles turned white. No, David was weak. He was stressed. He was blindly loyal to his wife, but he wasn't a murderer. Chloe had done this on her own. She had created the crisis she needed to enact the solution she wanted. I looked around the dark kitchen, at the spot where my coffee maker used to sit, at the empty walls where my memories used to hang. For 6 months, I had played the role they assigned me. I had been the compliant, slightly confused, deteriorating old mother. I had tried to shrink myself to fit into the margins of their lives so I wouldn't be a burden. But sitting there in the dark, feeling the agonizing throb in my spine and the cold, sticky tape in my hand, something inside me snapped. The compliant, quiet Eleanor died right there at the kitchen table. In her place, something else woke up. Something older, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. I remembered my husband Arthur, a man who built a fortune from nothing, looking at me across a negotiating table when we were buying our first business. "Eleanor," he had said, "never let them see you bleed. If they want a war, you don't give them a battlefield. You give them a graveyard." I slowly stood up. I walked over to the trash can, buried the ball of tape deep beneath the coffee grounds, and washed my hands. They wanted me to be a fragile old woman who couldn't manage her own affairs. Fine, I would give them exactly the performance they demanded. I would let them think they had won. I would let them weave their net of control, let them feel the absolute satisfaction of their impending victory. Because while they were busy plotting my move to a nursing home, I was going to quietly, meticulously, tear their entire world apart. The next morning, I initiated my performance. When Chloe came downstairs, radiating her usual aggressive morning energy in a pair of sleek athleisure leggings, I was sitting at the dining table, staring blankly at an unlit candle. I had removed my makeup, let my hair hang loose and unstyled, and allowed my shoulders to slump inward. The heavy medical brace on my left wrist rested on the oak table like a tragic prop. "Good morning, Eleanor," Chloe sang out, bustling toward the refrigerator to fetch her alkaline water. "How are we feeling today? On a scale of 1 to 10, how is the back?" I didn't answer immediately. I let a full, uncomfortable 5 seconds pass before I slowly turned my head, blinking as if pulling myself from a deep fog. "Oh, good morning, dear. My back? It's a bit stiff. Did David leave for work already?" Chloe paused, her eyes narrowing slightly as she assessed me. "Mom, it's Saturday. David doesn't go to the office on Saturdays. He's upstairs on a Zoom call for his fantasy football league." "Saturday," I repeated, my voice hollow and quiet. I looked down at my hands. "Right. Of course, I get so turned around sometimes." I saw the flicker of triumph in Chloe's eyes. It was microscopic, a tiny tightening of the muscles around her mouth, but to me it was as loud as a siren. She walked over and patted my good shoulder. "It's the trauma from the fall, Eleanor, plus the painkillers. It's completely expected that your cognition would take a little dip. Just rest." For the next 3 weeks, I played the masterpiece of my life. I became a ghost haunting my own hallways. I asked David the same question twice in 1 hour. I accidentally put my television remote in the silverware drawer. I walked with a pronounced shuffle, wincing audibly whenever I passed the basement stairs. And just as I had calculated, their vigilance morphed into complacency. They stopped trying to subtly trick me and began talking about my future with the brazen openness people use around toddlers or pets. They left brochures for assisted living communities casually draped over the coffee table. They spoke about selling the house while I was sitting in the very same room, convinced I was too absorbed in my knitting or daytime television to comprehend the financial vocabulary they were using. Their hubris was my camouflage. It gave me the freedom to move invisibly. On a crisp Tuesday in early December, Chloe left for a half-day mindfulness retreat, and David was at the office. The house was mine. I immediately dropped the shuffle. I walked briskly into Arthur's old study, a room Chloe had repurposed as her meditation space, stripping it of his leather armchairs and replacing them with floor cushions. But she hadn't touched the heavy oak wainscoting on the far wall, mostly because it was glued to the drywall and too expensive to remove. Arthur had been a man who trusted banks for his money, but not for his secrets. Behind the third oak panel from the corner, concealed by a nearly invisible magnetic latch, was a flat, fireproof wall safe. He had shown it to me a decade ago, laughing that he felt like a spy in a Cold War movie. I pressed my thumb against the hidden groove and slid the panel back. The keypad beeped faintly as I punched in our anniversary date. The heavy steel door swung open. Inside lay the archived history of our marriage. Our original marriage certificate, David's birth records, Arthur's honorable discharge papers, and a thick accordion-style folder bound by a frayed elastic band. I pulled the folder out, brought it to the kitchen island, and began to sift. I wasn't looking for cash. I was looking for leverage. I needed to know exactly what assets they thought they were getting when they forced the sale of this house. There were old life insurance policies that had already paid out, tax returns from the 90s, and deeds to cars we hadn't owned in 20 years. But tucked in the very back, inside a yellowed manila envelope, was a heavy parchment document with an embossed state seal. It was a property deed, dated 40 years ago, for a parcel of land in upstate New York. I remembered it vaguely. Shortly after we were married, Arthur had bought it on a whim from a grieving widow who needed quick cash. It was 40 acres of rugged, undeveloped woodland bordering a large, unnamed lake. We had gone up there exactly once, camped in the freezing rain, and decided we were not outdoor people. Arthur used to joke that it was his apocalypse bunker, but over the years we had simply forgotten about it. The annual property taxes were so minuscule they had just been auto-drafted from an old checking account we barely monitored. I ran my fingers over the typed ink. The deed was held under a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. That meant when Arthur died, the property had bypassed probate entirely. It belonged solely, unequivocally, to me. I pulled my iPad from my tote bag. I had let Chloe believe I didn't know how to connect it to the Wi-Fi, but in reality, I used it every night when they were asleep. I typed the county name and the parcel number into the local tax assessor's database. The page loaded. My eyes scanned the screen, stopping abruptly at the assessed value column. I took off my reading glasses, rubbed my eyes, and put them back on. The number hadn't changed. It was 7 digits long. My heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I opened a new tab and searched the local news for the specific county and lake name. The headlines flooded the screen in bold black font. Silver Lake Eco Resort gets final zoning approval. $1 billion luxury wellness retreat to break ground in spring. Developers scramble for remaining lakefront parcels. I clicked on a topographical map of the proposed resort. Right in the center, acting as the crucial connecting artery between the planned golf course and the luxury waterfront villas, was a red shaded square representing a privately owned parcel holding out on the sale. It was my 40 acres. I sat at the kitchen island, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the granite countertop. I wasn't just a widow sitting on $500,000 of suburban home equity. I was sitting on a gold mine, a highly coveted, strategically vital piece of commercial real estate worth millions. And David and Chloe had absolutely no idea. They had been so focused on vultures circling the carrion of this house that they had missed the crown jewels entirely. I carefully folded the deed, slipped it into my tote bag, and closed the hidden safe. I had found my armor. Now I needed to understand exactly the nature of the enemy I was fighting. I had spent months directing my silent rage at Chloe. It was easier that way. It is a terrifying thing for a mother to look at her own child and see a monster. It was safer to believe that my sweet, sensitive David, the boy who used to cry when he accidentally stepped on a snail, had simply been corrupted by a manipulative, greedy woman. I believed he was weak, yes, but I didn't believe he was cruel. 2 nights later, the universe decided I was strong enough to bear the absolute truth. It was past 1 a.m. A winter storm had rolled in, lashing sleet against the bedroom windows. I woke up needing a glass of water. I slipped out of bed, leaving the lights off, and stepped into the hallway. As I passed the staircase leading down to the main floor, I heard a voice. It was a hushed, frantic whisper coming from Arthur's old study below. I crept silently down the stairs, pressing my back against the wall to avoid the boards that creaked. I stopped on the bottom landing, hidden in the shadows, just outside the partially open door of the study. David was pacing. The glow from his laptop illuminated his face, highlighting the deep lines of stress etched around his mouth. He was holding his phone to his ear, his knuckles white. "I know what the margin call is, Greg," David hissed into the phone, his voice tight with panic. "I saw the email. You don't need to call me at 1 a.m. to remind me." He stopped pacing and rubbed his forehead aggressively. "Look, I told you I have the capital coming," David said, pleading now. "The crypto fund tanked. I get it. I know I leveraged too much, but I have an asset. We're putting my mother in a facility by the end of the month. The house will go on the market the second week of December. It's a seller's market. It'll go for at least $700,000. The equity will cover the shortfall in the bridge loan." I stopped breathing. The air in the hallway turned to ice. "No, Chloe doesn't know the extent of the debt," David whispered harshly, glancing nervously toward the ceiling. "And she can't know. If she finds out I blew our savings and leveraged my 401k on a shadow fund, she'll divorce me before the ink is dry. She thinks we're selling the house to invest in a rental portfolio for passive income. Let her keep thinking that." A long pause as the man on the other end spoke. David's shoulders slumped. "She won't be a problem," David said, and the cold clinical detachment in his voice made my stomach heave. "My mother is basically out of it anyway. She fell down the stairs last month, totally lost her grip. She barely knows what day it is. We're having the lawyer draw up the power of attorney this week. I'll have full signatory control. I just need a 30-day extension on the loan, Greg, please. I'm giving you a guaranteed payout." He wasn't protecting me. He wasn't even protecting his wife. My son, my flesh and blood, had gambled away his life on foolish, arrogant investments. And instead of facing the consequences like a man, he had looked at the woman who gave him life, the woman who had wiped his tears and paid his college tuition, and saw nothing but a lifeline made of cash. Chloe was terrible, yes. She was narcissistic and manipulative, but she was just the blunt instrument. David was the architect of my destruction. He had watched her strip away my dignity, watched her lay the groundwork to declare me incompetent, and he had silently cheered her on because her cruelty perfectly served his desperate financial need. He was willing to lock his perfectly sane, healthy mother in a nursing home, a place where I would slowly wither and die from isolation, just to cover up his own humiliating failures. I turned around and walked silently back up the stairs. My legs felt like lead, but my posture was perfectly straight. I didn't shed a single tear. The reservoir of maternal forgiveness, a well I had drawn from for 35 years, had instantly and permanently dried up. When I reached my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the mattress and looked out at the sleet hammering the glass. I thought about the power of attorney document he mentioned. They were going to try to force my hand soon. Thanksgiving was exactly 1 week away. It was the perfect time for a family intervention. They would corner me, use my supposed fragility against me, and demand I sign my life away. I reached for my iPad on the nightstand. I opened my encrypted email account and drafted a message to a name I had found during my research a few days prior. Sterling & Associates, one of the most ruthless and respected elder law and estate planning firms in Philadelphia. "Mr. Sterling," I typed, my fingers steady on the glowing screen. "I require immediate legal counsel regarding the establishment of an irrevocable trust and the sale of commercial real estate. Time is of the essence. I am available to meet discreetly this Thursday." I hit send. The fragile, confused Eleanor, who was afraid of the stairs, was dead. Arthur's wife, the woman who had helped build an empire from a single storefront, had returned. Thanksgiving was coming. They were preparing to carve me up and serve my assets to save themselves. They had no idea that I was the one bringing the knife. 2 days before Thanksgiving, I sat in a high-backed leather chair in the downtown offices of Sterling & Associates. Arthur Sterling was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite and aged in oak. He didn't offer me platitudes or pity. He offered me a cup of black coffee and a sharp, calculating gaze as I laid the upstate New York property deed on his massive mahogany desk, right next to the flash drive containing the audio recording of David's late-night phone call, which I had managed to capture on my phone. "My son intends to have me declared incompetent to seize my primary residence to cover his debts," I stated, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor I had been practicing at home. "I need to protect my assets, all of them, and I need to ensure that when he makes his move, he walks directly into a steel wall." Sterling listened to the recording. He reviewed the deed. He asked me a series of complex financial and historical questions to assess my baseline cognition, a standard protocol. When he finished, a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "Eleanor," he said, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers, "they are operating under the assumption that you are a wounded gazelle, They have no idea they are trying to corner a lioness. We are going to establish an irrevocable trust today. The lakefront property will be transferred into it immediately, completely shielding it from any power of attorney your son might attempt to execute. As for your current residence, we will place a quiet legal lock on the deed. If they try to list it, red flags will trigger across the county registry. He handed me a sleek black folder. Go home. Eat your turkey. Let them put on their show. Do not argue. Do not justify yourself. When they hand you the paperwork, simply walk away. You have the ultimate luxury now, Eleanor. You don't have to fight them, because legally they have already lost. I left his office feeling a profound, terrifying sense of liberation. The invisible chains of maternal obligation had been shattered. When Thursday arrived, the house smelled of sage, roasted vegetables, and a suffocating tension. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. For decades, Arthur and I had hosted 20 people at a time. A chaotic, loud, joyous collision of extended family, friends who had nowhere else to go, and neighbors. My tables had groaned under the weight of butter-basted turkeys, rich sausage stuffing, and 3 different kinds of pie. Today, the table was set for 3. Chloe had insisted on taking over the cooking, claiming it was her gift to me so I could rest my healing back. In reality, it was another exercise in control. She served a dry, free-range turkey basted in something that smelled faintly of coconut oil, alongside a pale, watery cauliflower mash and a sugar-free cranberry compote that tasted like pure acidity. We sat in the dining room, the crystal chandelier casting a harsh light over the anemic feast. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the clinking of silverware against fine china. I watched my son. David was sweating. He had unbuttoned the collar of his expensive Oxford shirt, and his eyes kept darting toward the sideboard, where a thick manila envelope rested ominously next to the gravy boat. He drank his Pinot Noir in large, desperate gulps, seeking liquid courage for the execution he was about to perform. Chloe, on the other hand, was radiant. She wore a rust-colored silk blouse, her posture perfect, her face glowing with the righteous adrenaline of someone about to do something terrible under the guise of benevolence. She dominated the conversation, talking endlessly about her mindfulness app and a recent podcast on generational trauma. I ate methodically. I chewed the dry turkey. I smiled politely at appropriate intervals. I was entirely detached, floating somewhere near the ceiling, watching this grotesque pantomime of family life play out below me. As Chloe cleared the dinner plates and brought out a plate of gluten-free pumpkin squares, David cleared his throat. It was a loud, abrasive sound in the quiet room. He reached behind him and picked up the manila envelope. The air in the room instantly changed. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Mom," David began, his voice tight. He placed the envelope on the table, resting his hands flat on top of it. "We need to have a family talk, a serious one." "Oh?" I said mildly, taking a small sip of my water. "About what, dear?" Chloe reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was warm, but the gesture felt like a clamp. "Eleanor, we love you so much. You know that, right? Since Arthur passed, we've just been so worried about you. And these last few months, well, it's been hard to watch." "Hard to watch?" I echoed, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. David leaned forward, refusing to meet my eyes. He stared instead at my collarbone. "The memory lapses, Mom. The confusion. And then the fall. It was a wake-up call for Chloe and me. We realized we can't provide the level of care you actually need here. I'm working all the time. Chloe is building her business. It's not safe for you to be alone in this big empty house with stairs and hazards everywhere." He opened the envelope and pulled out a glossy, multi-page brochure. He slid it across the polished wood toward me. The Oak Haven Active Adult and Memory Care Community. The cover featured a group of silver-haired models laughing on a manicured lawn, looking like they were in a pharmaceutical commercial. "We toured it last week," Chloe chimed in, her voice adopting that sickly sweet, high-pitched tone one uses to coax a toddler into a bathtub. "It is gorgeous, Eleanor. It's like a luxury resort. They have a hydrotherapy pool, art classes, and specialists who are trained to help with cognitive decline. You'd have friends your own age. You wouldn't be so isolated." "We've already put down a deposit to hold a premium suite," David added quickly, rushing his words as if trying to get them out before he lost his nerve. This house is just too much of a burden. We've spoken to a realtor. They estimate we can list it next week and have it sold by Christmas. It's the perfect time to downsize. I looked down at the brochure. I didn't touch it. I let the silence stretch out, heavy and absolute, forcing them to sit in the discomfort of their own audacity. I watched David's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. "It's a big transition, I know," David said, his voice dropping to a softer, pleading register. He was trying to sound like the dutiful, caring son, but I could hear the frantic ticking clock of his margin call beneath every syllable. "But to make it easier, so you don't have to stress about the logistics or the bills, we had a lawyer draft some paperwork." He reached into the envelope again and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, bound by a blue paperclip. He slid them next to the brochure, followed by a heavy silver Mont Blanc pen, the very pen I had gifted him when he graduated from business school. "This is a durable power of attorney for healthcare and finances," David explained, finally forcing himself to look me in the eye. His pupils were dilated, dark with desperation. "It just gives me the legal authority to sign the listing agreement for the house, handle the transfer of funds to pay for Oak Haven, and manage your medical decisions if you have another bad day. It's purely protective, Mom. It's so you can just relax and enjoy your golden years." Just relax. Put your head on the chopping block and just relax. Hand over your independence, your wealth, your home, and the very autonomy of your own body, so my son can cover his gambling debts in the shadow market. "All you have to do is sign on the yellow sticky tabs," Chloe encouraged, tapping the edge of the document with a manicured fingernail. "We even have a notary coming by in 20 minutes to make it official. We wanted to get it done on a holiday, surrounded by family, so you feel supported." Supported. Ambushed. The semantics of betrayal. I looked at the documents. The crisp white pages filled with dense legalese, designed to strip away 68 years of agency with a few strokes of ink. I looked at the silver pen, then I looked at my son. I stripped away the veil of maternal blindness and saw him not as the boy I had raised, but as the man he had chosen to become. A man who would trade his mother's freedom for a bailout. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The time for tears had ended in the dark on the basement stairs. I reached out and picked up the silver pen. David let out a breath he had clearly been holding for minutes. Chloe's shoulders dropped in visible relief, a triumphant, self-satisfied smile blooming on her lips. They thought they had won. They thought the old, confused woman had simply surrendered to the inevitable. I held the pen in my right hand, feeling its familiar weight. I looked at the line designated for my signature, and then, very calmly, I placed the cap back on the pen. I laid it horizontally across the top of the power of attorney document. I folded my linen napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it dropped into the dining room like a boulder into a glass pond. David blinked, confusion washing over his face. "No? Mom? What do you mean, no? We just explained—" "I heard your explanation, David," I interrupted, my voice smooth, cold, and utterly lucid. I sat up perfectly straight, letting the protective posture of the frail old woman fall away completely. "I comprehended every word, and my answer is no. I will not be signing a power of attorney. I will not be moving to Oak Haven. And you will most certainly not be selling my house." Chloe let out a nervous, breathy laugh, exchanging a panicked glance with her husband. "Eleanor, you're just overwhelmed. The cognitive issues are making you resistant to change. The doctors say this is very normal for someone in your state of decline." "Stop playing doctor, Chloe." I cut her off, my tone sharp enough to draw blood. Chloe recoiled, her mouth snapping shut in shock. I had never, in the 6 months they lived with me, spoken to her with anything less than gentle accommodation. I turned my gaze back to my son. "I am not declining, David. My memory is flawless. My mind is entirely my own. I know exactly where my glasses are. I know exactly what day it is. And I know exactly what happened to the anti-slip tape on the basement stairs." Chloe went entirely rigid. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax statue in her rust-colored silk. David stared at me, his jaw slack, the realization dawning in his eyes that the script he had written had just been shredded. "Mom, the stairs?" David stammered, his facade crumbling instantly. "You are drowning in debt, David," I continued, my voice echoing with a quiet, devastating authority in the dining room. I watched his eyes widen in sheer terror as I dismantled his secret. "You leveraged your accounts on a failing crypto fund. You are facing a margin call. You need hundreds of thousands of dollars to save yourself, and you decided that the easiest way to get it was to gaslight your mother, declare her incompetent, and liquidate her home. How do you... David choked out, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were stark white. I am your mother, I said simply. I know everything. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The physical pain in my back was still there, but adrenaline and a profound sense of righteousness masked it entirely. I looked down at the two of them sitting at my table, small, greedy, and utterly exposed. You brought a notary here for Thanksgiving to steal my life, I said, looking from the paperwork to David's terrified face. But there is nothing for you here. This house belongs to me. It is legally locked. If you forge my signature on those papers, you will be arrested for fraud before Monday morning. I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room. I didn't rush. I walked with the measured, dignified pace of a woman who owns the ground she walks on. I went into the front hallway and opened the hall closet. Hidden behind Arthur's heavy winter coats was a small leather weekend bag I had packed 3 days ago, and my tailored wool coat. I slipped my arms into the coat and picked up the bag. Behind me, the dining room erupted into chaos. I heard a chair scrape violently against the floor. Mom! Wait! Mom! Please! David's voice cracked with genuine hysteria. He came stumbling out into the hallway, Chloe trailing behind him, her hands covering her mouth in shock. You can't just leave, Chloe shrilled, the mask of the serene wellness guru completely shattered, revealing the panicked opportunist underneath. Where are you going? You're an old woman. It's freezing outside. Right on cue, the heavy, muffled honk of a car horn sounded from the driveway. I opened the heavy oak front door. A blast of frigid, snow-laced air swept into the foyer, swirling around my ankles. A black Lincoln Town car, dispatched by Sterling's office, sat idling in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the falling snow. I turned around to look at my son one last time. He looked exactly as he had when he was a teenager caught in a lie, frightened, small, and desperate for me to fix it. But I wasn't there to fix it anymore. You have until Monday to pack your belongings and vacate my property, I told him, my voice carrying clearly over the howling wind. If you are still here when I return, I will have the police remove you for trespassing. Mom, please! The margin call, they'll take everything. I'll be ruined, David begged, tears spilling over his eyelashes. You are a grown man, David, I said, stepping over the threshold into the winter night. It is time you learned to pay your own debts. I pulled the door shut behind me, the heavy click of the lock sounding like a gunshot in the crisp air. I walked down the shoveled path, the snow crunching satisfyingly beneath my boots, and climbed into the warm leather interior of the waiting car. As the driver pulled away, steering us down the quiet suburban street, I looked out the tinted window. I saw the silhouette of my son standing in the window of the home he had tried to steal, watching his salvation drive away into the dark. I leaned my head back against the seat and let out a long, slow breath. I didn't know exactly what the next week would bring, but for the first time in 6 months, I wasn't afraid. I was 68 years old. I was entirely alone, and I had never felt more powerful in my entire life. The first morning of my new life began not in the home I had occupied for 4 decades, but in a sprawling suite at the Four Seasons in downtown Philadelphia. I woke up naturally, without an alarm, and for a long moment, I simply lay in the king-sized bed and listened. There were no hushed, condescending whispers from the hallway. There was no aggressive hum of a commercial juicer pulverizing kale. There was only the faint, distant hum of city traffic, the sound of the world moving forward, and me along with it. I ordered room service, a pot of dark roast coffee and a warm croissant with real butter, and sat by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the gray, wintry skyline. I felt a profound sense of peace, but I knew this was the calm before the hurricane. You do not back a desperate animal into a corner and expect it to quietly go to sleep. David and Chloe were going to strike back, and they were going to use every dirty tactic in their arsenal. Monday arrived, the deadline I had given them to vacate the house. I was sitting in Arthur Sterling's office when his paralegal brought in the morning courier delivery. Sterling opened the heavy cardboard envelope, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He scanned the first page, his expression entirely unreadable. Then he let out a low, appreciative whistle. "Well, Eleanor," Sterling said, sliding the thick stack of legal documents across the desk toward me. They didn't pack their bags. Instead, they went nuclear. I picked up the top page. It was a court summons, a petition for emergency guardianship. I read the legal jargon, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach despite all my preparation. According to the petition filed by David, I was a danger to myself and others. It claimed I had abandoned my home in a state of severe delusion, that I was incapable of managing my finances, and that I required immediate, involuntary placement in a secure medical facility. But the truly terrifying part was the addendum. "They have a medical affidavit," Sterling noted, tapping the second page. "A Dr. Julian Vance, a licensed psychiatrist. He signed a sworn statement asserting that based on family reports and a telehealth observation, you exhibit classic late-stage markers of vascular dementia." I stared at the doctor's signature. Chloe. This had Chloe's fingerprints all over it. She was in marketing. She knew how to spin a narrative, and she clearly knew a doctor with flexible ethics who was willing to diagnose an unseen patient for the right price. If a judge signed this emergency order, sheriff's deputies could literally show up at my hotel, strip me of my rights, and lock me in Oakhaven against my will. "They think they've trapped you," Sterling said quietly, leaning forward. "They are betting everything on the assumption that an elderly woman who has recently suffered a fall and is under extreme stress will crumble under the intimidation of a court order." I looked up from the papers, meeting Sterling's sharp gaze. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a heavy, sealed envelope bearing the crest of Penn Medicine, one of the premier neurology institutes in the country. I placed it on the desk. 2 days after I fell down the stairs, while David and Chloe thought I was sleeping off the painkillers, I took a taxi to the university hospital, I said, my voice perfectly level. I checked myself in for a comprehensive 3-day cognitive and neurological evaluation, MRIs, psychological profiling, memory stress tests, everything. Sterling's eyebrows shot up. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face as he reached for the envelope. "The chief of neurology, doctor. Eris Thorne signed the final report himself," I continued, feeling the ghost of Arthur standing right behind my chair, nodding in approval. "He certified that my cognitive function is in the top 10th percentile for my age group. I have 0 markers for dementia, vascular or otherwise. My mind is entirely sound." Sterling opened the envelope, his eyes devouring the official medical charts. He began to laugh, a rich, booming sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Eleanor," he chuckled, shaking his head in absolute awe, "you didn't just build a wall. You built a guillotine." I knew Chloe was laying the groundwork to call me crazy, I said coldly. I just needed to let her commit perjury to do it. "This Dr. Vance is going to lose his medical license for signing a fraudulent affidavit, and Chloe and David could face charges for elder abuse and filing a false police report," Sterling said, his legal mind already calculating the destruction. He picked up his desk phone. "I'm going to schedule an emergency mediation for tomorrow morning. We'll invite their lawyer here. We won't even need to go before a judge. We are going to end this in this very room." The next morning, the air in the conference room at Sterling & Associates was frigid. I sat at the head of the long oak table, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that I hadn't worn since Arthur's funeral. I wore my grandmother's pearl necklace. I looked exactly like what I was, a matriarch of substantial means who was completely in control of her faculties. At 10 a.m. precisely, the heavy glass doors swung open. David walked in first. He looked completely unraveled. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin pale, his suit jacket wrinkled as if he had slept in it. The margin call was clearly tearing him apart from the inside. Chloe followed, exuding a brittle, desperate kind of arrogance. She wore a power suit, her jaw set tight, carrying a designer briefcase like a shield. Behind them trailed their lawyer, a slick, aggressive-looking man named Harrison, who immediately began unpacking thick legal binders onto the table to establish dominance. "Let's make this quick," Harrison snapped, not even bothering to sit down. "Mr. Sterling, your client is experiencing a severe psychiatric episode. We have the medical affidavits. If she does not agree to a voluntary conservatorship and sign over the deed to the property today, we will drag this through probate court, freeze all her assets, and the judge will force her into a state facility anyway. We are trying to save her from herself." David looked down at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. Chloe stared at me with pure, unadulterated venom. "You need help, Eleanor. Stop making this so hard on your son." Arthur Sterling didn't say a word. He didn't argue. He simply opened a thin, black folder and slid a single copy of the Penn Medicine Neurological Report across the polished table toward Harrison. "I suggest you read that very carefully, counselor," Sterling said, his voice deadly quiet, "before you say another word on the record." Harrison frowned, picking up the document. As his eyes scanned the letterhead, the seals, and the signature of the chief of neurology, the aggressive posture melted from his body like snow on a hot stove. He flipped to the second page. His face turned an ashen shade of gray. He looked at Chloe, then at David, and finally at Sterling. Is this certified?" Harrison asked, his voice suddenly sounding very small. "Certified, notarized, and time-stamped 3 weeks prior to the fraudulent affidavit your clients coerced Dr. Vance into signing," Sterling replied smoothly. "If you proceed with this guardianship petition, I will personally hand this over to the district attorney. Your clients will be prosecuted for elder fraud, and Dr. Vance will lose his medical license. I imagine the state bar might have a few questions for you too, Harrison, regarding your due diligence." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of a trap snapping shut. Harrison violently shoved the papers back into his briefcase, his hands shaking. He glared at Chloe with absolute fury. "You told me she was incoherent. You told me the doctor examined her in person. You lied to me." He snapped his briefcase shut. "I am withdrawing as your counsel. Do not contact my office again." He walked out of the room without looking back. Chloe's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. Her power suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big. David buried his face in his hands, a pathetic, broken sound escaping his throat. "Mom, please," David sobbed, completely ignoring the fact that his lawyer had just abandoned them. "The margin call. The bank is going to take my house. They're going to garnish my wages. I'm bankrupt. I need the equity from your house. Just the house. I'll pay you back, I swear to God." "Your debts are not my emergency, David," I said, my voice echoing off the cold glass of the conference room. Chloe suddenly slammed her hands on the table, her desperation turning into vicious anger. "He is your son. You have millions in assets tied up in that ridiculous house. You're just going to sit there and watch him lose everything? Watch your future grandchild grow up in poverty? We will sue you for emotional distress. We will tie up your estate until the day you die." I looked at Chloe. The woman who had thrown away my memories, manipulated my child, and peeled the safety tape off my stairs. "I actually don't have millions tied up in that house, Chloe," I said mildly. They both froze. David looked up, his tear-streaked face contorted in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Chloe demanded. I gestured to Sterling, who pushed a second document across the table. It was a wire transfer receipt. "Arthur and I owned 40 acres of undeveloped commercial lakefront property in upstate New York," I explained, watching Chloe's eyes widen as her real estate background kicked in and she recognized the location on the paper. "I sold it last week." Chloe picked up the receipt, her eyes tracking the zeros. $8 million?" she whispered, the breath knocked out of her. Then, a new kind of horrific realization dawned on her face. She looked at the buyer's name, Vanguard Hospitality Group. "Vanguard?" Chloe gasped, stepping back from the table as if it had burned her. That's my firm's biggest competitor. My CEO has been trying to acquire that parcel for the eco-resort for 5 years. If they find out my mother-in-law sold it to Vanguard, I imagine you will be looking for a new job by Friday," I finished for her. "You have $8 million, David said, his voice trembling, his eyes locked on the paper. "Mom, you can save me. It's nothing to you now. It's pocket change. You can pay off the loan." "I could," I agreed softly. "But I won't." I leaned forward, clasping my hands on the table. "Every cent of that money, along with the deed to my home, has been placed into an irrevocable trust. I am the sole beneficiary during my lifetime. Upon my passing, the funds will be distributed to a foundation supporting victims of elder abuse." I looked directly into David's eyes. "You have been completely disinherited, David. You will not receive a single dime from my estate until you turn 60 years old, and only if you can prove to the trustees that you have been debt-free and solvent for a decade." David stared at me, the reality of his total ruin crashing over him. He had gambled his mother's life, and he had lost everything. Chloe turned slowly to look at her husband. The veneer of the supportive modern wife evaporated entirely. She looked at a man who was deeply in debt, legally exposed, and cut off from a massive family fortune. "You idiot!" she hissed at him, her voice dripping with pure disgust. "You told me she was a pushover. You told me this would be easy." She didn't look at me. She didn't say goodbye to her husband. She picked up her designer briefcase, turned on her heel, and walked out of the conference room. I knew with absolute certainty that David would be served with divorce papers before the week was out. David sat alone at the massive table. He looked small. He looked like the little boy who used to play under the mahogany piano, but the affection I once held for that boy had been entirely burned away. "Leave the keys to my house on Mr. Sterling's desk," I told him, standing up and smoothing my skirt. "And do not call me again." I walked out into the crisp, cold Philadelphia afternoon. The winter sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the glass skyscrapers. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sharp, clean air. 6 months later, I sat on the expansive cedar deck of my new home, a beautiful single-story house nestled on the shores of Lake Champlain. The water was a brilliant sapphire blue, catching the golden light of the late afternoon sun. A gentle breeze ruffled the pages of the novel sitting on my lap. I took a sip of my dark roast coffee, letting the rich, bitter taste linger on my tongue. The Philadelphia house had been sold. David had declared bankruptcy, moved into a tiny apartment, and was navigating a bitter, brutal divorce with Chloe. He wrote me a letter once a month. I kept them in a box in my study, unopened. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it is not a requirement for peace. Trust, once broken by that level of betrayal, is a bridge that cannot be rebuilt. I didn't keep my wealth a secret anymore, and I didn't keep it to myself. I accepted a seat on the board of a national advocacy group that provided free legal counsel to elderly women facing financial abuse from their families. I traveled. I hosted garden parties for my new neighbors. I filled my home with vintage teacups, heavy velvet drapes, and a brand new concert grand piano. Society tells women that as we age, we are supposed to shrink. We are supposed to become quiet, compliant, and grateful for whatever scraps of attention our children throw our way. We are conditioned to believe that setting boundaries with our own flesh and blood is a betrayal of motherhood. But I learned the hard way that motherhood does not mean martyrdom. Age did not make me fragile. It made me dangerous to anyone who tried to exploit my love. I learned that the wisdom accumulated over decades of a life well lived is a weapon infinitely more powerful than youth or arrogance. My name is Eleanor. I am 68 years old. I survived a husband's death, a son's betrayal, and the insidious cruelty of a daughter-in-law who thought I was invisible. I am not invisible. I am the architect of my own life. And my golden years, it turns out, are exactly that. Golden, entirely my own, and fiercely protected.